We're rolling. Okay. We're with Wendy Whiteley. We're with Wendy in the Lavender Bay house, and timing is everything, I think, Wendy, because one of the paintings we're going to talk about is Rainy Day, and here we've got a really grey, overcast day. It's perfect.
Yes, yeah.
And this was where the paintings were painted from?
Uh-huh.
Was this house really the start of the love affair with Sydney Harbour?
Oh, no, I mean, who doesn't love Sydney Harbour? I lived on the North Shore, but up at Lindfield. Brett lived at Longueville, so he was on the inner bit of water. We used to get ferries everywhere and go to Luna Park as kids, and so everybody was aware of the harbour. We came here to visit a friend who was living downstairs, and this was a very, very run-down, dark and gloomy Federation house built in 1907 that had been converted into flats. And he had the downstairs flat, and the upstairs flat had just become vacant.
Oh, so it was
which is where we are now.
Right. So it was 3 apartments?
It was 2.
2, right.
2, because the basement level wasn't there. It was a basement, but it was just, crummy, under the house kind of stuff. And we went up in the roof, So
the paintings were done upstairs?
No, downstairs eventually.
Right.
Well, first off, that room there, over there, behind you, was Brett's studio. Sitting room studio. This was our bedroom. Archie slept in a little nook over there. So we squashed into this thing, and then Brett got the gasworks studio because this was just too small.
Right.
Then we bought the house and started converting it back into a house, built the tower and did all of that stuff.
Oh, so you built the tower as well?
Yeah.
But it really opened up that whole vista for you.
Well, we fell in love with Lavender Bay. It was extraordinary, very quiet. Hardly anybody knew about it. Luna Park was still functioning in the old-fashioned way, just the old dipper and the river caves and all of that kind of stuff. And really nobody came. There was no access to Luna Park from here before. So people just, had to park somewhere and walk down the stairs, which they still do to some degree. But then the stairs and things didn't bother us then. And it was 61, the tree out the front was much smaller, so you could see over the top of it. So the view from here, from this balcony, which was a closed-in kind of very cronky with windows you couldn't open, and we had a bit of chicken wire across that opening there with birds in there because you couldn't really use it for anything else.
Oh, right.
So we had a lot of pigeons, doves, and rescued peewees and God knows what. We had a cat and 2 dogs, and the cat used to bring home a bird, some bird occasionally. We'd grab it from the cat and put it in with all the other birds. We ended up having some parrots of some kind, but they ate all the plants. And then the pigeons, Brett's made quite a lot of drawings about that time. The pigeons, the doves, they were white doves, fantails, like Picasso's doves, with the fantails. They eventually got out and mixed with the park pigeons, and then we opened up the balcony. So we had a bird house there for the pigeons, and they started interbreeding with the park pigeons, of which very few remained, the park pigeons. Seem to have killed them all off in Sydney.
But
and sparrows.
Oh, so you really had an aviary sitting out there, basically?
Oh, it was an aviary, yeah.
Right.
And we had a bit of an aviary in New York, in the apartment in New York. We had a couple of very exotic birds that used to fly around the apartment.
In the Chelsea Hotel?
Yeah. And then they'd escape occasionally, and Brett would be running up and down 23rd Street trying to catch a bird. He's always loved birds.
This is sort of like archetypal Sydney, though, isn't it? You've got the Luna Park and the bridge, and then the bay. And sort of, they really became, to me anyway, those Brett images of that period seem to me to be Sydney.
This particular bay is very particular because it hasn't got any high-rise in front of it. Ironically, Harry Seidler and Leon Fink wanted to buy all of these houses and build some huge high-rise Miami-type apartments all around the bay. And that garden that I've made down there now was just a rubbish dump covered in weeds and impenetrable, basically.
Oh, well, we're really lucky
So that's
we're here.
the change that I've done in the last, after Brett died.
Right.
So, that's the change I've made, plus renovations to this house, But it kind of changed a bit by bit. The kitchen is now a recent renovation. That was cut off there. We started knocking down a wall here between the main room and this room one night at a drunken party we were having, and then had to call in an architect because Brett suddenly went, Jesus, the whole thing's going to fall down. So we had a ladder from there to there before the tower.
Oh, right. So
Or desperate to get a bit more space,
right.
you know. The house, these houses, you know, are not... Kingo lives next door, and he lives now in the whole house, and he's got his studio downstairs, or he paints all over the place. Even when Brett had the studio downstairs, which were the 2 main rooms downstairs, or we'd have a guest or something, it all started to get too small. And because we lived in New York for a couple of years, and the scale of Brett's pictures had gotten much bigger than they had been in London or earlier times, plus, you know, just American painting upped the scale of pictures. Back to more like artists in the old days that were doing commissions for churches or something. You know, it's all gone round in circles 15 times. So, you know, in order for Brett to paint alchemy and things like that, he had to have a much bigger studio. So he got the Gasworks studio and then moved to Reby Place and then had to move from there to the current studio just to have studio space.
You raised Kingo next door, and I think Storia was on the other side, wasn't it?
Storia was further up.
Oh, right. So it became
Tim
really
and
like a
Sharon.
little enclave, really.
Well, we came here to visit a friend who had been a painter in London but had reverted to being an architect and painter in Sydney, who was downstairs with his wife and 2 daughters at that time. And the flat became vacant, so they were still downstairs for ages. And then after we bought the house, there was a poet downstairs which we rented out a space to him for a while before we, you know, built the tower and got the connection going between the 2 floors again. And then there was the Sheridans, Noel Sheridan, who ended up running the contemporary art space in Perth for a few years, and their kids, who'd been very close friends of ours, both in London and New York. Irish family that came here eventually. And then Noel ran the art school in Dublin for years, and then now they're all back here. Noel died, and all the kids, the Sheridan kids and Liz, are back in Perth, where they ended up before they went back to Ireland. So, you know, it's been... We started off as Australian immigrants in England and lived in Ladbroke Grove with all the Irish immigrants at the time looking for cheap rent and somewhere to work that they could afford, and the Jamaicans at a kind of really good time, you know, when it was all about that. It was... Then all the, you know, the Rackman business happened in London, and, you know, all the people were being... because they wanted to gentrify and push the prices up of inner city London, same as happens here anywhere else.
All around the world, yeah.
And we gradually moved up the hill in Ladbroke Grove. So each time, we've always been very lucky, actually, in finding places to be and live. Yeah, really lucky. I mean, we were lucky to end up with the apartment we had in the Chelsea Hotel, because that had just become vacant, and it was actually laughingly called the penthouse, but, you know, it came with this big garden on the roof. So it was only 1.5 rooms, but it didn't feel like it because you had this big garden that you could go out to. But Brett had to get a studio across the road there too, because one room was no longer nearly big enough for Brett, Archie and I to live in as a family, and also for him to work.
Yeah, well...
The scale that he was working there.
Well, you got the size and the smell of the paint and everything as well. It must be...
The smell of the paint, the only smell I never liked was fixative. That awful sweet smell. The paint was okay, unless he spilt the ink all over my, you know, very proudly acquired new Killam rug, which should have to end up in the bath, and he'd say, what does it matter? You know, I'm making art. And then he'd put his bloody drawing in the bath as well, you know, get the drips going and things. So that was always a bit of a... And when he was working in the house, he liked to be with us, you know. But then Archie wasn't allowed, and the dogs weren't supposed to work on the drawings and walk on the drawings, which they did occasionally. They got trained not to, finally. Don't walk on the drawings, you know. Walk anywhere else you like, but don't walk on the drawing. It's always a thing with painters and their families, you know, about space and kids and starting to own things. Until we bought this, we didn't own anything, except an occasional cronky car.
Now, when you've got the release of the 3 new fine art reproductions, and 2 of them are Sydney Harbour, and you made the selection. What made you select the 2 Sydney Harbour ones to start with? What was it about them that you thought was so important?
Well, to be perfectly honest, when you're doing reproductions, you're doing things you think people will like. And certainly Sydney likes harbour pictures. The 3 works we've done so far are 3 works that I still own. People like them. You weren't going to get up anybody's nose. The art gallery's done, you know, a couple of that they poster type reproductions of the things they own before. 15 dog pictures is is something that people just relate to.
Oh,
I think
I
you just, you have a tougher time if you're going to do reproductions of more esoteric things. So I don't know about drawings. I'll think about that in the future.
Yeah.
Because we've done posters before,
yeah.
and they're not bad as posters, but these are, much higher quality, obviously. People's expectations are different. I've never really approved of the posters being framed or, I think posters are posters and they should just be stuck up with blue tack, and when they fall off the wall, then that's the end of them.
Yeah, short lifespan.
Yeah, not to be put into framing shops and, have the edges cut off. And then people that's the problem, people ring me up and say, I've just bought this drawing of Brett's up in an auction up in whoop whoop somewhere. And I say, madam, you've bought a bloody poster. You can buy it at the Archive of New South Wales for $25, with some hideous frame on it. You've got to be careful with these things. It's just, really why my approval for this had to be very precise. And as Brett knows, get it right. Otherwise don't bother. We'll just make some posters.
With the Pisses of Paris, which I
15
love.
dog pisses.
15 dog pisses, sorry. I think it's a wonderful piece, but I also love the way, because Brett used that impasto thing and there was that sort of, that organic feel about the painting itself. How does that lend itself, do you think?
Lend itself to reproduction? Well, it's okay now because we got it right. So you can see the difference between the thick paint on the top of the thing where there's charcoal lines still left in there. And Brett's always worked like that. Always, from the early abstractions onwards. There's always been things either on the top or bits of string stuck on them or, layers of oil paint. And then in the 60s, a lot of it was powder colour with PVA. And everything was stuck on with PVA in those days. Every artist on earth was using PVA with great alacrity to stick things on, or Brett gouging into the pictures sometimes, difficult to reproduce that, where you've got a 3-dimensional thing happening on the surface as well. Because they're very definitely 3-dimensional in fact. So, when you're going to do reproductions, it's very wise to choose the image because you can get too complicated,
Well, you can't have that 3D thing of sticks on there, but I think the stonework on that wall looks fabulous, the way it sort of sits
Brett worked very hard to get it right. So you can actually see what's going on. And very hard to get the fact that one thing is a charcoal line and not a, painted on and things like that. Just see it. It's as close a reproduction as you could get.
I think it was an interesting choice, and you've got the 2 Sydney Harbour paintings, and then you've got the Paris one. Do you see this as something you can do some more of, depending on how successful it is? Have you got some idea of where you'd want to go with them?
Everything will be all right on the opening night, and we haven't reached the opening night of this yet. We'll see how we go.
I think that there is a latent desire to have Brett Whiteley work, but you can't. Not everyone can afford to buy on the secondary market a $1 million Brett Whiteley painting, for instance.
Obviously, very few people can, but stuff done by the museums and things is seems to me to be getting more and more difficult because they've reverted now with digital photography to, you make an order to get a poster out of them, and then they get them done. It's I'm not sure how this will go. I'm just hoping it'll be all right for everybody. I mean, people in Australia used to have reproductions on their walls all the time. Vincent's Sunflowers being one major piece, and Tretyakhov's bloody head of a woman. That awful fucking thing was in every house in Sydney, practically, with a kind of like frame that went like that around the edge, you know, that stuck out around the edge. Both the sunflowers and the Tretyakov. And they're two such vastly different works as far as quality is concerned, not the reproduction, but the work itself. You'd wonder why people buy kind of icons, you know, they don't really know the difference between being a great work of art or not.
Yes, but these three works definitely are iconic works of Brett's, aren't they?
They're very good works of Brett. So, you know, if you like Whiteley and you want to have either any of these three works, it's an opportunity. But they have to be, you know, treated properly as for what they are.
But you've been very careful in how you've approached the project too.
Well, I didn't approach the project. I was approached.
Sorry, let me rephrase that. Brett brought the project.
I was approached, and
right.
because I know Brett very well and things, I started contemplating it. And I know he's had difficulties with some of the museums and things. They're not prepared to, you know, put that much money into them. They'll make reproductions and sell them as posters or something.
Yes, but you're going to have a much more closely, you know.
Well, the paper is good, the embossment is great, we've got them as accurate as possible. You know, you're never going to get with a reproduction the surface of the paint. That's end of story. It's a reproduction, but it's a beautifully done reproduction of each of those works on beautiful paper. And if people can't afford to buy, you know, an original work, this is as close as they're going to get to being able to have something like that on their walls. They're not exactly the same size, they're not exactly any of those things, you know, but they're very different from those terrible kind of almost fakes that they were doing on canvas at one stage that looked like it was paint but badly done. You know, they're very different. They're good quality, very good quality reproductions. And, you know, they're limited edition at this stage. That pig is missing an ear. Sorry.
Did you notice the pig was missing an ear?
I did.
Did you?
That was great.
That must have happened recently.
That was great. How do you think Brett would feel about the reproductions?
Brett would do anything if it wasn't going to in some way irritate the shit out of him, you know, for more than 5 minutes or... Sorry, the thing's just crashed to the ground.
Do we need to
so
start that one again?
That out.
No, that's okay.
You can use that as a crash.
Yeah. Well,
Anyway,
we put everything in, it's okay.
You're going to edit all of this anyway, aren't you?
Yeah, we are. Do you want to start that question again, or are we right?
No, that's
No?
fine.
Okay.
Brett had a very, you know, he didn't like the details of things. Sometimes I'd have to handle it. You know, everybody who worked with Brett at any stage knew that. It was, do this. If you don't get it right, fuck you. If you get it right, fine. How much do I owe you? Get out of my face. You know, because I'm busy. I'm doing stuff. I've got a tendency to be a bit like that. If it goes on for too long and I get bored, then, you know, it's like, for fuck's sake, cut to the chase and, you know, let's just get on with this or not get on with it. I mean, Brett's quite famous for that comment, which I give Donald Featherstone his due. He left it in the video, that Featherstone thing, where he asked him some dopey question, and it was dopey, about Vincent van Gogh, and Brett just says, well, bloody well, go off and do your research, man, you know. I get constantly fed up with being asked the same question over and over again because I bore myself, you know, just talking like a parrot all the time. So I might throw in a curly one there just to upset everybody. And all that research stuff has got to be done beforehand. You know, you can't, artists don't have time to sit there and correct people's stuff and, you know, I don't even have time to do it.
Well, look, I think the selection's really good. I must say, and I think the dog pisses is probably my favourite of them. But I think that
that's really the one you can buy. I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll discuss that a bit later, Brett. But I think it's a really good selection, and I think they have been really well done, which is critical to the thing being successful. But just to revisit that, the question really was if drawings, because I think you do have to be very careful.
Don't push me into drawings now, because we're not
No.
made a decision about drawing.
It's just about what suits that medium best, and I think clearly the ones you've chosen suit the medium of the reproduction really well.
Well, I think we might be getting a Matisse show soon. Certainly, if you've seen any Matisse shows and things, you realise that he's a absolutely quintessential artist that is beautifully done in reproduction by drawings. And in fact, half of London's full of fakes that have been done by reproduction that they're selling as, original Matisse prints or drawings and things. So you have to be very careful about those things at the same time. But
do you get very concerned about the fakes and the things that sort of float around?
do I get concerned about them? Yes, they make me furious. It's a complete waste of time, and where the fuck up has been right from the beginning, and the dealers and things not being educated enough to realise the difference.
Some of them are pretty good, though, I must say. I've looked at some fakes, and somebody spent a lot of time making sure they look good.
Who?
Oh,
which one? Are we
I was
now
looking.
referring to?
No, not the Brett ones. I was looking at a program on the ABC recently where they were looking at some.
In Europe.
Yeah.
There've been some amazing fakers in Europe.
I mean, really well done.
Well, they get
down.
There's been some very good fakers. I mean, forensic testing is kind of sorted that out, and then you get, in the old days, you also got, in the very old days, they all had assistants as well.
Yeah, well, that gets really muddy, doesn't it? You go to a studio.
Yeah, whether it's painted in a studio or painted by one hand or painted, by bits of it are painted by one hand and bits of it are painted by others. They were busy, producing these half the time gigantic things or icons for churches and things, and there was a very strict style related to them. Time sorts that out. I'm just talking about the fakes that have been produced as we speak. Having the artists alive helps with that, even the Aboriginal artists, when they were still alive, like Rover Thomas and things, they could come and say that I didn't do this. But when they're dead, you've got to go through all this tedious business.
The great thing about Brett is his star has kept shining, and a lot of people don't actually have that.
They're not as good as Brett.
Yeah.
Simple answer.
Yeah. That's it.
Some of them should have given up their job a long time ago, done something else. They would have done it better, probably. Not, everybody who paints is a great painter.
No, but even some of the better painters, like, even Lloyd or Arthur Boyd, I don't think.
Well, Lloyd's been neglected, but because of this, influx now of contemporary cutting edge and everything's got to be fucking video or an installation or something. Lloyd Rees hasn't had enough attention, but I think that will be fixed over time. And there are people that have collections, museums and things that have collections of Lloyd's work. Brett loved Lloyd Rees, but because he was also teaching architecture, he wasn't the kind of personality that spent a lot of time. Brett's the first of his. He's a much younger generation than Lloyd Rees. Artists, painters weren't pop stars at the same time they were painters.
Oh no! Well, you look at John Brack or any of that.
They wore suits and they behaved themselves.
When I photographed Nolan, he still wore a suit and tie.
Yeah.
Well, Sid always dressed like that, but he was very articulate and very forthcoming when he felt like it. Not everybody can stand being interviewed more than once.
I mean, when you think about that generation that came through when Brett was beginning his climb, if you look at today, what do you think about where the art world is going?
I've ceased to think about it much because I don't really care. Because it won't be here. I just want to, fix up. I do sometimes think, oh my God, I'm sick of getting all these invitations to these shonky shows, and I'm not going to them. But I suppose it's always been the case.
Well, there's always a little bit of cream on the top, isn't there, basically?
Well, there's always somebody in there that you're interested in seeing how they're going. There's a couple of much younger people that I'm interested in. The rest of 98% is dross. 98% has always been dross. And they'll fade into obscurity. And then there are people that go out of fashion and they pick them up again, 25 years later or something, or for some other reason, like somebody gets a bee in their bonnet about women painters or something. So they get a turnaround again. Often because of the market.
Well, and the art schools keep pouring out students, so the market just gets
The art
fatter and
schools
fatter.
keep pouring out students, and most of them can't get a job, and most of them wouldn't know the difference between a good piece of art and a bad piece of art. And so they'll end up being teachers, they'll end up being admin people, there's not enough jobs for them. But it's not a bad place to grow up. A bit of fun.
Art school.
Yeah, why not? That's a new thing too. So many art schools trying to teach people to be different things, video artists, photographers, design, all the things that was kind of going on, but not to such a great degree when I was going to art school.
Now, I know you and Brett met at art school.
No.
No?
We didn't
Maybe
meet
before
at
that?
art school.
Oh, really? Sorry?
I
So,
was going to East Sydney Tech. It's now what's it called now? Sydney College of the Arts or something.
Yeah.
It's a studio base in the old jail. I was going there, and a friend of his took me on a date, and he said, "Oh, you'd like to meet Brett Whiteley because he's interested in painting." So he took me around to his house, and that's where we met, long ago. He'd seen me apparently, according to him, he'd seen me marching up and down Rose Street, going to Jericho's, which I always did for lettering class, because I had no intention of being a commercial artist. So I didn't need to learn lettering, in my view, or a couple of other things at the arts, because I'd go to Jericho's and with my best drawing, on the outside pinned to my portfolio, and my tight jeans, some eccentric thing that I'd made out of Marimekko thing with paint all over it and bare feet. My mother would cross the street if she saw me coming. Oh my God, here comes my daughter, look at her. And we met, and then he took me out on a date to Jack Santry's sketch club, and that was the end of everybody else.
now, you're involved today with a huge amount of work cataloguing and archiving the work that Brett did. Does that leave you any time to do any painting for yourself?
I don't paint.
Don't paint?
No, not anymore. I don't have time. I just don't feel like going back to it either. I just think, what for? What have I got to prove? I know I was talented. I didn't have the obsession. And I found it extremely difficult to even think about it, doing both things at once. Before, we were living in small spaces together, pretty tight-knit. And when we were in Lavender Bay, I was going to work in the day, which got me out of his hair and him out of mine, because I had to get dressed up and go and work as a fashion underbuyer for Harbour Nichols, a completely different world, on the 52 bus, and come back in the evenings and get mad at Brett and Mike Johnson because they'd made some hideous mess, which I'd then have to clean up and cook something, and then get dressed up again the next day. And they would have been, or maybe at the pub, maybe having a rollicking good time.
As boys do.
Young artists, schlepping off to Harvey Nichols' little shop, which I was very glad to have the job at the time, and we couldn't afford it to even pay the rent. It was before Brett started to have exhibition, and the scholarship in Italy was over. But even in Italy, we were living in one room, and there was no room for me to paint. And Brett just would have, been obsessed about whether or not I was doing the shopping and, cooking the meals, and if there were any Italian blokes trying to, pinch my bum or get on to me.
Is there only room for one painter in a family then, do you think?
More or less. I've never known it to be that successful. There's been, even with women painters, there's been one supportive person who's doing something else, and there's been the painter. Helen Frankenthaler and Robert Motherwell were married. They both of them had inherited a great deal of money. So they had separate studios, and they didn't have to worry about who was cooking, basically. Pollock and Lee Krasner and Pollock completely subverted really Lee Krasner's, you know, ambitions in many ways, and it really caused problems in their marriage. I frankly think Lee Krasner was more talented than Pollock.
Well, you had Lee Miller and Man Ray as well, and I mean, you know.
Some of them figured it out, but it was, you know, the Man Ray Lee Miller thing didn't last long, did it? It's like two actors marrying, but they're both getting work, or one's getting a lot of work in a movie, and the other one's staying at home being a kind of house parent, and it seems to create problems. Or they both have a lot of success, and they're always making different movies in different countries, so they're never spending any time together.
Yeah, it's like the Hollywood movie stars, isn't it? It just explodes.
Yeah. But I liked having me around. I think when we started getting separate studios, it started to create problems, because I didn't want to be in his bloody studio all the time, sitting there waiting, you know, to clean up or something. I was doing other things. I was dealing with Archie in the house and, you know,
Wow.
doing domestic things.